The idea of a PM makes no sense in the future. That's Keith Rabois on Lenny's podcast, and he's not saying it to be edgy. He's saying it because AI is compressing the time between idea and shipping so fast that the old machinery of roadmaps, handoffs, and intermediaries starts to look absurd. Welcome to AI Digest. The payoff here is practical. You get a specific way to think about talent, speed, and what actually makes a company win when the tools change every month. Rabois' core claim about roles is simple. As building gets easier, the scarce skill shifts to deciding what to build and why. He references a Peter Fenton podcast that convinced him traditional product management breaks under current conditions. The classic PM move is gathering inputs, turning them into a tidy sequential roadmap, then organizing execution. But when things that were impossible to do in November are pretty easy to do right now in March, a one-year roadmap starts to feel incoherent. Instead, the winning startup notices what just became possible this week and turns it into customer value next week. Lenny pushes back. If the hard part is aligning everyone around what to build, doesn't that make the PM more important? And the answer is yes, but not as a coordinator. The skill looks more like being a CEO now, which is understanding the business equation, seeing leverage points, and creating things that might move the needle, often directly with AI tools. The making is getting democratized. The choosing is getting more valuable. And suddenly, a lot of careers want to migrate into the same tiny space. Which leads to the oldest advantage that doesn't get automated: people. The most important lesson Rabois says he learned, and he credits Khosla for distilling it, is that the team you build is the company you build. Founders get distracted by market, customers, product, technology, but if you have the right people, everything else gets easier. If you have the wrong people, everything else gets harder. He points to PayPal as the proof, an incredible density of talent that Peter Thiel and Max Levchin pulled together. What's more interesting is his own admission. Early in his career, he was mediocre at hiring strangers. The move that changed his trajectory wasn't some clever interview trick. He started stealing people internally, recruiting talented people already in the building who were under-leveraged. That taught him something diagnostic. He could identify talent with context. The typical interview wasn't giving him enough signal. And then he drops a tactic that's so extreme it's hard to forget. Tony at DoorDash does 20 references on every senior hire. 20. There's also an older Greylock lesson he repeats. You keep reference checking until you hit a negative reference. The subtlety is that references only work if you ask the right question. He gives the example of Max at Fair. If you ask, was Max a good employee, you get mixed answers. Ask, is Max capable of being a world-class entrepreneur? And the answer becomes yes. If you're wondering why all this matters so much, it's because most hiring mistakes aren't neutral. They pile up into a very specific kind of organizational drag. Rabois has a framework that explains a pattern every scaling CEO has lived through. You raise money, you hire a lot of people, burn goes up, and somehow it doesn't feel like more is getting done. The reason, he says, is that the number of people who can independently drive an initiative from inception to success is limited in any company. He calls these people barrels. If you hire more people without increasing barrels, you're just stacking ammunition behind the same initiatives. That increases collaboration tax, coordination tax, and the whole company's drag coefficient. You spend more and ship less. His PayPal example is wild. About 254 people in Mountain View when acquired, and depending on how strict you are, maybe 12 to 17 barrels. He asked Jack Altman once how many barrels were at Lattice. The answer was 2. And Rabois says that's actually common even for very good companies. A barrel is the person you can point at a hill and say, "Get us over that hill," and they will. He tells a tiny story that makes it concrete. At Square, he wanted cold, healthy smoothies delivered at 9 p.m. for engineers working late. There was an office team and EAs and a whole apparatus, and it still couldn't happen. Then an intern, Taylor Francis, says, "I'll solve it." And at 9 p.m., smoothies show up. That's the moment he says, "Oh my God, I found a barrel." If you're building in the AI era, this framework gets sharper. AI increases the amount of ammunition any one person can wield, which makes the scarcity of barrels even more defining. So how do you actually get them, especially when the best people are still impossible to land? There's standard recruiting advice that still matters. Sell the mission, sell the vision. Great people will have options, and you have to convince them your opportunity is special. But Rabois has a more tactical angle. The best pitch is when a candidate's specific superpower overlaps with the company's current critical blocker. Then they're not just betting on your company, they're betting on themselves. He uses his own Square story. He was at Google briefly after an acquisition and planned to go into venture. Square's investors told him they'd spent almost a year looking for someone who knew financial services and was still entrepreneurial. They framed it as only 2 or 3 people in the world could do the job. That argument pulled him in. Then he flips it to what sounds like a strategy, not just a recruiting tip. He thinks you have to build on undiscovered talent. You don't want to compete for the people everyone else wants. He compares startups to sports salary caps. As a startup, you not only have a cap, you have maybe 1/10 the cap of the giants. If you try to buy the same players, you lose. So what's a sign of undiscovered talent? He looks for why the big company recruiting machine won't process them correctly. Sometimes it's just lack of data. One reason hiring for undiscovered talent skews younger isn't because you need young people, it's because younger people have fewer data points. Now you've got barrels, you've got undiscovered talent, you've avoided coordination bloat. There's still one more thing that separates the truly great companies early, and it's a trait that's almost embarrassing in how simple it sounds until you see it up close. Rabois says one of the most subtle early signals of exceptional companies is speed. Not performative hustle, an operating tempo that shows up early, then compounds. He remembers a Square board moment. After 2 board meetings, Roelof Botha told him he hadn't seen that kind of tempo since PayPal. In one board meeting, the company identifies an opportunity or problem. By the next meeting, they've shipped solutions, addressed it, and added features. He saw the same thing at Fair. Delian Asparahov shadowed him at 2 board meetings and said it was the one company that could pull him from venture. Something would be slightly off, and by the next morning meeting, they'd identified root causes, shipped fixes, and measured impact. Ramp is the cleanest example. He led the seed round around May of 2019, then tried to preempt the Series A in September, really fast. One input was watching them get to the precipice of shipping cards in about 3 months. In financial services, he says, that usually takes 9 to 12 months, best case. Speed like that doesn't come from yelling, "Move faster." It comes from talent density, barrels, and a culture that treats time as the scarcest resource. And once you're moving that fast, one of the classic startup rituals starts looking not just unnecessary, but actively dangerous. Because it can poison your brain. And yes, this is where he goes after talking to customers. Rabois doesn't hedge this. I hate talking to customers. I refuse to allow colleagues of mine to talk to customers. This is specifically about consumer, SMB, and micro-merchant products. He says it's not merely unhelpful, it's often directionally wrong. The argument is psychological. In consumer land, a lot of purchase behavior is subconscious. When you ask someone to explain a subconscious decision consciously, they tell you stories that aren't the real cause. Ask someone why they bought a Porsche or Lamborghini, and 99% of the time, they'll tell you every reason except the real reason. And even if you know your customer sample isn't statistically representative, the danger is that once you hear the anecdotes, you can't unhear them. People will say, "I talked to 8 customers," then pontificate for an hour, and now the whole team's mental model is contaminated. He makes one exception. Hardcore enterprise customer development can work, because there's a decision maker making mostly utilitarian decisions. He gives an example of an AI company with 30 must-win accounts, where you actually can talk to all 30 customers. For mass-market products, he wants founders to rely on foundational insight, then pressure test the logic in other ways. DoorDash wasn't built from customer interviews saying, "I want a button to deliver food." The stat that clicked for him was that 93% of restaurants in the US don't deliver. Then Andrew Mason's line popped into his head, that phones should have 2 buttons, "I'm bored" and "I'm hungry." Suddenly, DoorDash was the "I'm hungry" button. The hard part was making it economically possible. Airbnb is similar. Brian Chesky had evidence, like the number of Craigslist listings where people wanted to rent someone's bedroom. But if you asked 10 random people whether they'd stay in a stranger's home, most would say no. Customer feedback would have killed it. So the mandate becomes, have the insight, ship the thing, sell tickets. If you're not selling tickets, adjust the trailer, distribution, casting, script, but don't let 8 customer calls write your movie. This worldview also explains another Rabois belief that makes a lot of modern managers flinch. He thinks high-performance machines aren't built on psychological safety. They're built on winning. One of the management lessons he absorbed from a great founder is the opposite of standard HR training. Criticize people in public. He breaks down the system logic. If you give negative feedback one-on-one, you're optimizing for the atomic unit, not the system. The rest of the company likely suspects there's an issue, but they don't know leadership is on it. Public feedback signals that the problem is real and being addressed. It can also invite help. Someone else can raise their hand and offer support, rather than leaving the person to go fix it alone while everyone quietly worries. Lenny asks the obvious question. Doesn't this create a scary environment? Rabois basically says, you want to win. And yes, there's an art to it. Great coaches do a mix. Some feedback goes to the whole team, some is private. But he's explicit about the underlying belief. He doesn't believe psychological safety is the core ingredient. High-performance machines don't have psychological safety. They're about winning. He suggests reading Jordan Rules or watching The Last Dance. Then he adds a counterintuitive nuance on criticism. When a company is struggling, he's often less critical and more supportive. The founder already knows it's going badly. When a company is thriving, that's when he pushes harder. That's when complacency sneaks in. Which is also where the AI-era career anxiety shows up. Because a lot of people feel like they're sprinting, the ground is moving, and the old roles are melting. His advice isn't to panic, it's to get curious, aggressively. On the career side, Rabois agrees AI will radically reorient lots of paths. But the way through it, in his mind, is intellectual curiosity. He shares a detail that surprised him. In some of the best organizations he's seen, the #1 consumer of tokens is the CMO. Not because marketing suddenly became technical, but because curious leaders can now do work directly. They don't need deputies and deputies to get real work product. They can run analytics, draft campaigns, and hand the CEO actual insights. That's the thread running through everything he says. Barrels aren't about job titles. They're about outcomes. Tempo isn't about working late. It's about shortening the loop between noticing and shipping. And the future of PM versus engineer versus designer is less about turf, more about who can understand the business and use the tools to move it. The lingering question is uncomfortable in a motivating way. If AI just gave everyone more ammunition, are you becoming a barrel? Or are you waiting behind someone else's initiative hoping it goes well? If you want the full set of hard edges, the stories, and the contrarian management philosophy, listen to Keith Rabois in this episode of Lenny's podcast.